How's it going, Professor? My book review is going to be on Rivalry and Alliance Politics in Cold War Latin America by Chris Darnton. Darnton with the Darnton. So, to start with the background on the author, he's an associate professor of national security affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. His work focuses on the domestic politics of foreign policy, particularly related to enduring rivalries and conflict resolution, counterterrorism cooperation and alliance management, regional integration, as well as state building. He is a Latin Americanist. His research and teaching emphasizes the international politics of the Americas, with particular interest in what new archival evidence reveals about the Cold War era and beyond. His focus is, of course, Latin American foreign policy in relation to the United States as well. So the author's goal, thesis, and main points are used in this book to analyze a series of rivalries in the Cold War Latin America and derive from broader lessons for alliance politics and conflict resolution. He begins with the problem between rivalry and rapprochement. During the Cold War, rivalries within the Western Bloc undermined alliance coordination, particularly in the Americas. The shared threat of communism and related insurgencies helped some U.S. allies, but not others, to transcend rivalries within one another. He also discusses the levels of rapprochement that also involves itself. Darnton moves then toward what's called a parochial interest within the region, how policy changes have been brought about within the Latin American region. He developed this parochial interest theory of international form between rivalry and rapprochement. Darnton argued that government agencies with vested interests in policies associated with rivalry act to prevent national leaders from achieving cooperation with a rival nation, except in two conditions when it's satisfied, which is an alternate mission and a state resource constraints, which I found to be incredibly interesting while reading. He uses this particular theory to explain why a common foe induces a rapprochement between some rivals but not others. The other point, the author points out that policy changes are profoundly distorted. For example, the author mentions he makes light of these assertions by bringing up how militarism constricts the range of policy options available to leaders at their disposal. He also then leads toward what I consider a case study within the book that details the antagonism and anti-communism within Argentina and Brazil, between Argentine and Brazilian relations. He makes note of the origins between both countries, how they both agreed on over 100 accords, and the emphasis on rapprochement paved the way for a strategic alliance to occur, as well as regional cooperation. However, he also mentioned that there was territorial disputes that began to grow, causing a bit more instability and tension between both countries. His argument for this is that the alternative security mission of anti-communism only displaces rivalry when post-war economic expansions falters. This explains why both Argentina and Brazil favored rapprochement despite the antagonism between both countries in decades past. Darnton also mentions in this section that it was never going to be the United States' fault that this rivalry was maintained by both countries, that there is this competition between both Argentina and Brazil fighting over necessary resources and having a more consistent alliance, which I found to be very telling because it's very pertinent to many alliances that we have today. Both Argentina and Brazil are South America's largest countries, therefore leading them to be engulfed in distorting effects on U.S. policies. This included the severing of military assistance agreements between the United States, and I felt that the lesson that I received from the author is that anti-communism deeply influences security decisions making in both Argentina and Brazil throughout the Cold War, but a long-lasting rivalry still persisted in years' time. The author later in the book goes more in depth about how about another rivalry situation in Cuba, in particular the Cuban Revolution in 1959, and the rivalries in Central America. He argued that the critical barrier to cooperation in early Cold War Latin America was the policy preference structure of the armed forces, and that there are two main variables that he mentions that I felt were interesting, which were the mission availability and state resource constraints, which was also similar to in the beginning of my presentation here about one of the constraints about state resources. Some of the arguments I picked up from this section is the emphasis of three core principles that he mentions in principle about cooperation within Latin America. The first was the Cuban threat and the U.S. indifference, which made a lot of sense to me, knowing that the United States and Cuba were not on great terms, especially as a rivalry endued. Of course, the support for the military and the extended support that the military gave in order to alleviate severe resource constraints that I felt were also very similar. Next, the other point that he makes is regarding the 1980 debt crisis within the continent, and as well as the Andean rivalries that the United States had with the Andean region, which is based in, of course, South America. He assesses the case of rapprochement between Argentina and Chile, where both countries were deep in tension but solved through cooperation. It followed this when Darton mentions that the United States' involvement between both American and Andean rivalries were particularly focused under the Reagan administration. President Reagan focused more actually on Central America and the Caribbean. For example, from previous talks that I've had with other classes, the Reagan administration focused a lot on the Caribbean because of the invasion of Grenada, which was pretty big, but it was very under the radar type of conflict. Rather than South America, which would then reaffirm the primarily domestic conditions that were enabled between both Argentina and Chile, that would then further overcome their rivalry later on. His final point that I found to be important throughout the book, toward the end of the book actually, regards the Cold War to global war on terrorism, where he acknowledges that there is inherent flaws in uncritical reliance on historical analogies that Latin American countries face. Like, he also targeted and explained the struggle, concludes that a protracted global ideologic struggle and a manifestation of common threat from local insurgent vanguards and a central role for alliances and coalitions in countering any threat that is posed, which I found as very pertinent, because when the United States has a conflict, they are destined to focus more on a struggle of ideology and as well as having a central role for alliances to play and have coalitions being built so that they are able to alleviate pain within a country that the United States, or even in this case Latin American countries, being able to curb threats that are posed toward them. So I argue that this book was written not just to speak on alliances, but what alliances can do to bring out the rivalries within countries. It was written to express the importance for why there are alliances that do in fact focus on rivalries that can lead to either conflict or cooperation. Like an example between Argentina and Brazil, or in Argentina and Chile, are perfect examples that I mentioned in my talk. It's important that the book was able to bring necessary detail to situations in decades past within South America that are important to understand today, which makes it important for the political atmosphere that we are in right now, which I found was very important as well, and something that I was not aware of past historical ties and historical analogies in Latin America that fundamentally altered my understanding for what was going on during this, the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then up until now. The main points that I mentioned in my presentation that the author argues throughout the book I feel are very valid, and I agree with pretty much all of his points he made. The reason why I agree for this is because it makes a lot of sense that there's a rivalry within countries, especially in Cold War Latin America, but that there's also rapprochement that occurs. But more importantly, it's issues out a common phenomenon that every political scientist understands, and that it be the power of rapprochement. Many of the points mentioned explained in the full background of the rivalries within the Cold War Latin America era that help understand alliances between South American countries. I strongly feel that the author did in fact show a lot of success in arguing for these emphasis of the rivalries and how rapprochement is issued throughout the continent, and how each country is able to deal with some type of conflict, but also have a way to move toward cooperation that also alleviates some of the distractions or the barriers that may persist, which I found is very pertinent today for the United States and alliance politics. For the book, like looking back at it, if I had to nail down a conclusion, I would probably come up and say that in the 50s and 60s and even 70s, 80s, and even today, that there's so much focus on countries trying to like one up each other, trying to get under each other's skin, and that is what one of the biggest things I took from the book was that a lot of countries in Latin America were just itching for more strength, more power, more leverage over each other, that I found to be very telling, because there's a complex of actors wanting what's best for their countries, but at the end of the day, they're always finding a way to make it. Probably find a way to simply say that they want to expand some, if not all, a majority of their influence, which definitely involves conflict. From what I got from the reviews of this book, it gets given very high bars. There's a gentleman by the name of O.A. Weston. He's the author of The Global Cold War, Third World Interventions, and the Making of Our Times. He mentioned that the author, Christopher Darden, has written a book that is indispensable reading for all students of Latin American affairs and of security decisions globally. His research in Latin American sources is outstanding, and his focus on regional economic variables is very significant for the overall debate on security decision-making. Harold Trakunas, he's works at the Charles W. Robinson. He's a Charles W. Robinson Chair and Director of the Latin American Initiative at the Brookings Institution. He mentioned that Christopher Darden provides a fresh perspective on the transition between rivalry and rapprochement among states, grounded in the nuanced theorizing and careful historical research. This book examines Cold War Latin America to arrive at the counterintuitive finding that parochial bureaucratic politics explain the persistence of interstate rivalry, and that the rapprochement is driven as much by shifts in military missions and resources as by diplomacy. The last two come from Stephen R. Rock. He works at the Vassar College. He said that rivalry and alliance politics in Cold War Latin America is a major contribution to the international relations literature. He said Darden offers a novel and compelling parochial interest argument to explain both rivalry and rapprochement. This lucid and carefully researched and convincingly argued book also offers fresh insights into the international and domestic politics of Cold War Latin America. Lastly, Richard Feinberg from Foreign Affairs mentions that political scientists will appreciate Darden's well-aimed jibes at the major schools of international relations theory, and Latin American specialists will welcome his deft applications of cutting-edge theories to a region long underrepresented in political science scholarship. So I feel like this book is very, very applicable to our alliance politics class, because the discussion of alliances and the criteria that is argued for alliances having rivalries be pertinent to not just countries in South America, but to include all nations, including the country that I am alliance manager of, Japan. The biggest strength I saw from this book was, in many ways, it was organized in a very thorough way. It was a very easy read. The organization was pretty simple. Like, it had miniature subheadings for each of the points that Darton wanted to make. I thought that was probably the biggest strength of the book throughout. The biggest weakness, actually, I would argue, is that it could have been a bit more, not concise, but it could have been a little bit shortened. There is sections in there that, for sure, are important, but they did not have necessarily an important focus on the emphasis of the rivalry and alliance politics of Cold War Latin America. So having enjoyed this book that I read by Darton, I would definitely highly recommend it to political science experts, political science scholars, political scientists, especially those who are interested in Latin American politics, Latin American affairs like myself. Also, political science majors and international relations majors will definitely enjoy this book as an easy read that could be a bit more concise, but definitely hits on the important points, especially if they want to know why in Cold War Latin America there was an abundance of rivalry that was issued out, as well as rapprochement, and how the power of rapprochement was key in several relations between, whether it be Argentina and Brazil, Argentina and Chile, the United States and Andean rivalries, all the above. So I definitely enjoyed this book and highly recommend it for future students. Thank you for listening, Professor, and have a great day.